Uh, First, I want to thank all of you for coming here today. This is a really important initiative for us at NSF in CISE, and I definitely want to particularly thank the organizers here. They've really done an amazing amount of work and really provided some great resources. So thank you so much, Borchin and Heather, and of course, thank you to the whole steering committee. Thanks, Colleen, Ron, Nancy, Tracy, and Mary. This has been, we could not do any of this at NSF without all of this work. So thank you for this. And this is part of really a broader initiative, which is, how can we address how to broaden participation in computing? What can we do? There have been a lot of projects that have tried to address this issue and tried to address these long-standing issues of underrepresentation. And what this is, what you see pictured here are a number of different efforts on the part of different BPC-focused projects. But what I'm here today to talk to you about. And of course, sorry, I've thanked the organizers, but it's important to upfront also thank all of my colleagues. Margaret Martinosi, the director for CISE, but I want to thank everyone else in CISE who's really contributed to this effort. This is not just, I'm just here speaking, but our whole education and workforce cluster has really what make this happen, because they're the ones who are responsible for trying to make sure that we are able to come up with strategy and actually see this whole BPC pilot through. So starting off, it's important to understand that there are lots of definitions of underrepresentation. And we in CISE have a particular definition, and so saying that we strongly encourage meaningful actions that address long-standing underrepresentation of various populations, including women, African Americans, Hispanics, American Indians, Alaska Natives, Native Hawaiians, Native Pacific Islanders, and persons with disabilities in the computing field. That's a lot of different groups. Right, that's over 70% of the U.S. population, and we check, and every single place that we fund has some of these people there. So there are other groups that are also disenfranchised in many ways, and we are in no way saying that you cannot address those, but we're saying that you should, at least at the same time when we talk about underrepresented groups, this is the groups we're talking about, and we'll discuss further like how we want you to particularly address these. So where did this all come from? Back in 2012, the CISE Advisory Committee came up with our strategic plan for broadening participation. And they noted that it's going to take more than just good intentions or business as usual to reverse long-standing underrepresentation. One of the questions we get often at NSF for CISE is like, what's different about computing? And that long-standing and stubborn underrepresentation is one of the issues, right? And in order for us to make progress, it's not just about what we do with specific activities that are entirely designed for broadening participation, but we really need committed, focused, and sustained efforts on the part of the entire computing community. So how we're going to do that is we're going to do that by addressing broadening participation through activities that are as an accepted and expected part of our research portfolios. So the idea is, let's not just do broadening participation on the side, but if you're going to have a substantial size research project, that you should have some kind of broadening participation effort. And in order to actually make that kind of change, you have to do that. We have to provide some resources, and we have to provide some supports around that. So first, we have these requirements. So the requirements are requiring meaningful BPC activity in an expanding set of CISE programs. The thought being that we started with our biggest ones and we're moving down a bit, but the idea is if you have a substantial research project, you should be having some kind of meaningful BPC activity. But we also need to provide support, and that's support for the PIs that are presenting. We also need support for the reviewers who are going to provide feedback. And then we have to assess how we're doing with this pilot. It's a pilot. We're in the third year of this pilot, and we need to understand, like, we have to review, so provide really useful feedback on all the BPC plans are submitted. And we also need to see what happens to those plans. So we require reporting of the outcomes for those BPC plans in the annual reports of awarded projects. What's our vision? So we have this vision of broadening participation is embedded within the CISE research community. So our requirement is that we want research proposals to include a meaningful plan for broadening participation in computing. And then we expect that over time, the quality of plans will improve, so the amount of reviewer feedback that we require is going to decline. And when you're thinking about broadening participation, this is really a community effort. And if something works well at one institution, that might work well at someplace else. So we, as plans are implemented, we expect that the lessons learned from implementation are going to be shared. And internally, we monitor and support the progress of BPC and assess how things are going. And we also expect that as we go along, we are going to see that folks who generally work on broadening participation will collaborate more and more with your standard CISE researcher to have better outcomes. And then we have this measurable progress towards diversifying the CISE research community. That's our overall goal. And the way that we do that is in one of four ways. So you might have research activities. So those research activities, I think we'll talk more about what these might be, but we see a lot of these where people want to do something that's tied into the research. It doesn't have to be tied into research. In many cases, maybe it shouldn't be tied into research. Another option that people often choose are outreach activities. But I want to make sure you really consider activities that are faculty development and departmental development, because those are well within your sphere of expertise and also within your sphere of influence. You may not necessarily be able to change how a seventh grader might decide to go on and become a computer scientist or not, but you have a lot of potential impact on what the experience is for undergraduates in your current program. So we definitely like you to look into that. As specific examples, so for research activities, a common thing might be we want to involve someone in research. We want to involve someone from an underrepresented group. You want to make sure that's a scaffolded activity. So CRAWP has the DREW program, Distributed Research Experiences for Undergraduates. And they collaborate with Access Computing and IMCS, which focus on persons with disabilities and African-American students, respectively. And you can partner with DREW to host 2 RU students each summer. And if you follow the link, you'll actually see a plan that gives you an example of a BPC plan of how you might use something like DREW. On the outreach side, you might say that you want to go out and teach computer science to local students, but you want to make sure that you're actually situated in a place where you're going to actually be able to find students, particularly students from some underrepresented groups. Well, it turns out the Girl Scouts are everywhere in America. They are happy to work with faculty who want to volunteer to teach computer science to a Girl Scout troop. So that way you actually have an audience, and then you actually have a way of having that spread more broadly if there's success. There are things you can do on the departmental development side. So you might say, well, what we want to do is we want to address retention in our major. So the Commanded University Award asks you to analyze retention data so that you can get a better idea of where are the pain points in your program, where are the points where people come in and where you have differential retention of particular underrepresented groups. And then you might think about faculty development. You might want to learn about what are the kinds of practices you can do as a faculty member to improve your courses and make them more inclusive, or other things you can do in your research group, et cetera. And NCWIT has a number of resources for that. We also encourage you to partner with the BPC Alliances. CISE supports 8 alliances that have long-term experience engaging in BPC activities at scale. If you want to address different groups or different points in the pathways from K-12 all the way through the workforce, these alliances will be able to help you with that, because they have this experience and they have the breadth in order to do this. And they're all signed on to try to help projects that actually want to do this. And I also want to point out that if you are going into K-12, one program that we run is the CS for All program, and the CS for All consortium includes all of these different curriculum providers, teachers, and different organizations that are trying to provide engaging computer science to all US students. So CS for All consortium is helpful, and the CS for All teachers.org is a community practice for teachers that we can also have. So I'm happy to answer any questions about any of these alliances, but the main thing you should be thinking about is partner, right? If you don't need to do this all your own, I very much encourage you to partner. We've done a couple years of working on the BPC Pilot, and one of the things we found and our reviewers found is if you want a meaningful BPC plan, and that should describe an evidence-based, sustained response to a well-articulated aspect of broadening participation. We don't expect you to solve all problems. We expect you to determine, here is some particular issue that you have some evidence that there's a challenge, and that you have some kind of response that you can do as part of this project, and that will have some kind of outcomes that you at least have some way of assessing, am I making some progress? But we understand that many CISE PIs, especially those new to BPC, might not be in a position to develop or execute such a plan. So we want to provide resources, but we also are taking a stage of development view of how we're looking at this. So rather than saying you have a good or a bad plan, we're saying, all right, you might be getting started, or maybe you actually are on the right track to this evidence-based response, so you're evolving, or you really have a meaningful plan, in which case we'd consider you to be impactful. And what makes a plan? If you look in the CISE core solicitation, we have 5 elements of a meaningful BPC plan. So first part, context. So you need to describe what your local context is. And BPCNet can help a lot with this. You want to know what are the particular institutional contexts that you have here. So what percentage of female students do you have at your university? What percentage do you have in the major? And what are the goals of your overall proposed activities? What are you trying to do? Are you trying to get to equity? Are you trying to get to the point where you don't have differential retention? There are a lot of goals you could have, but you need the context to understand that. Then you need a particular intended population, where you want to identify the demographics of the participants and what the level is. So you might say, I'm going to focus on African-American undergraduates, or I'm going to focus on female high school students. But you want to make sure that you have some particular intended population. And then you need a strategy. And the strategy is what you're going to do. So you have some set of activities with some intended outcome. And key thing is, the solicitation states, you need a role for every PI and co-PI. So that can vary, right? Every PI and co-PI don't have to participate in every activity, but there needs to be some role stated. Then we need to know, well, how are you well prepared to do this? If your idea is, I'm going to bring in 4 students from an HBCU and have them in your lab. Have you done that before? Why do we think these are going to, why are you going to be successful? So any past engagement that you might have, or even if you don't have any past engagement, then what intended preparation or training do you have so that you can successfully implement the proposed work? And finally, but certainly quite important, is that you want to have some kind of way that you know that you've actually succeeded. So you have to have some plan for the measurement of the outcomes of the proposed activities. So if what you're saying is we're going to incorporate some number of students in the lab, like how are you going to count the number of students? How are you going to determine whether they had a good experience or not? The way that we've reviewed these proposals is key. So the idea that we have right now, and where most of our BPC pilot effort is going towards our core programs, so the CISE core programs. And we also, so a plan is required at the time of award for medium and large proposals. You don't have large proposals in FY21, so you don't have to worry about that. And that's also true in cyber physical systems and the secure and trustworthy computing. What the solicitation says that you need to include 1 to 3 page descriptions of your planned BPC activities under supplementary documents. And we strongly encourage you to do that. And we're going to provide feedback. And how do we provide feedback? Well, we want to make sure that everyone knows what the elements of an effective plan are, like what we just discussed. And we want to actually provide some high quality feedback on those plans. Just so you know how it works, when you submit your proposal to the core, BPC experts in a separate panel will review the plans prior to the CISE core panel. And the CISE reviewers will use those BPC reviews to inform their discussion. You will see the BPC reviews and you'll see whatever the CISE reviewers say about those BPC reviews. But it's important to recognize that the BPC plan does not affect how the reviewers rate your proposal. So it's not going to affect whether it's fair or good, and it won't affect the award recommendation. Like, program officers are not using it. But it is important to note that you have to have a meaningful BPC plan at the time of award. So it's very helpful to submit a plan with your proposal so you can get feedback so that you can quickly and efficiently make sure that you can have a meaningful plan at the time of award. When we think about that, we want to check to make sure, are people actually submitting the plans when they submit their proposals? So that, for the most part, yes. So in last year, we had 75% of the projects submitted a plan. This year we had 89%. So we'd like to get that even higher, but the key thing is most people do submit a plan. Now, are those plans all judged by the BPC reviewers to be great? Well, not currently. We'd like everyone to be impactful. Right now, 60% are at the lowest level, which is getting started. Now, that doesn't mean that they're failing, but means that they're missing some key elements. 33% are evolving and 7% are impactful. And we're trying to assess, again, this is a pilot, so we're looking at how is this working? So we have internal metrics, like how are the program officers using the BPC reviews and what can we do for our CISE program officers? But we're also thinking about what can we do to improve plans more broadly. And that's where events like this one come in, because part of what we're thinking is perhaps by having workshops, and particularly by providing departmental support, that's going to help as well. And then we want to know what the challenges and opportunities are for BPC within the CISE community by listening to you all. So we hope that we'll get feedback that will help inform this overall pilot today. So please get back. So now, why are so many plans getting started? So there are a number of common pitfalls. So one is every PI needs to have a role and responsibility. If you just say, here are a bunch of activities, but don't specify what the roles and responsibilities for each PI are, then it's not a good plan, because we don't know how it's supposed to work. Another issue is a lot of people will list really interesting activities, but don't have any metrics whatsoever that we can expect that that can be reported in your annual report. That's a problem that's pretty easy to address, but sometimes you might want to consult some people with some BPC experience to come up with what are reasonable metrics there. And it's not just about counting people, but you also want to think about, thinking about like what the quality of the experience was. Important thing to think about is what the demographics of your intended population. You don't need to tell us what the percentage of women in the United States is, or the percentage of women in the United States in computing is. It's far more useful to find out what it is at your institution. And you can find out that information. BPC has resources, and your university also has some resources for that. Unlike a regular size proposal where you're doing technical research, novelty is not either necessary nor even are necessarily desirable. You do not necessarily have to be novel, right? Instead, you can build on best practices and existing efforts. If your institution has some program in your college, work with them because they likely have all of these things above. And then a really common problem is confusing broader impacts and broadening participation. Broader impact is one of the two NSF merit criteria. Broadening participation is a possible form of broader impacts. However, say you're going to have a camp. You're going to have a camp for local students that helps teach them about your research. So you're going to have a robotics camp in your area. That's a great broader impact. If you don't have particular plans for how you're going to ensure that there will be students from your intended population there, that if you don't have saying we're going to have a camp and we're going to have particular recruitment efforts to make sure that there are female students there, then it's not necessarily broadening participation. So you need to go beyond just here's this thing that I'm doing that is good for the research and good for the world, but what is this doing for your intended population that you argued for? And finally, you might, one thing we see often is saying, here's this list of students I've had in the past. So that's a good thing. We like to see that you've had 3 female students in the past, but it'd be nice to know, is that 3 out of 5 or 3 out of 90? And what does that mean in terms of your particular discipline? Right? Are you in a discipline where there are very few female students, or are you in a discipline where there are a lot? Right? And we'd also like to know what are the particular recruiting and mentoring strategies that you've used in the past and that you'll use in the future to make sure that they actually have good experiences. So again, it is really good to say that you've had experience, but explain what the actual things you'll do to make sure that you're successful. What we're here to do at this workshop is develop departmental plans. And part of what we found by reading through, you saw in that earlier slide, I had to go through 400 BPC plans this past year, and we did 450 the year before, or whatever. It was quite a few. And we want to make sure that PIs have support, and that also we want to make sure that, for example, metrics are kind of hard for an individual project to do, but they're quite reasonable to do at the level of a department. You might have some, it's much easier to assess for the department to look at what's the proportion of women in our undergraduate program? What's the proportion of women that continue on from CS1 to CS2? And also the department is there to help sustain these efforts. So that can help as well. And the idea is that you have this departmental plan that you develop, and then faculty contribute to it. So the PIs say, all right, here's this department plan. I'm going to link to this department plan, and I'm going to contribute in the following way to these activities. My department participates in the Drew program. I'm going to participate in some way, right? Those are things you might do. So yeah, I did want to highlight, please look at the recently revised FAQ for the BPC Pilot, which addresses a lot of questions that you might have. I'm happy to answer any questions that you have now. Is that appropriate, Heather? And also, the updated core programs solicitation, which has an updated information about the BPC requirement that match most of what I have up here. But one key aspect for what you're doing right now is that the solicitation specifically states that you can give a link to your departmental plan in your BPC plan. So there's one project BPC plan that you submit that's 1 to 3 pages. And so, for example, say you have a multi-institutional 3-institution project, it's going to be very difficult to fit 3 departmental plans and how everyone's going to contribute. So you can put a URL in there so that the reviewers can refer back to that so that they can see the departmental BPC plan. Okay, but thank you so much